big ass cigars, the big ass cigar of life. Anyway,
Radio Free Infinite, episode 216. So there exists this country called Japan, and amongst other things, they're pretty famous for their metal. Some of you out there might know about all the Visual Kei bands like X-Japan, Ion, and Gargoyle. Some of you might be more into the wealth of Japanese black metal bands, including Sabbath, Psy, Abigail, Endless Dismal Moan. Others of you might be more about the death metal bands over there like Transgressor, Intestine Balism, and Vomit Remnants. And some of you might even know a bit about the older school of Japanese metal concerning bands like Loudness, Anthem, and Earthshaker. Well, this week we are going to be covering a band that falls into that latter category, but I'm guessing most of you probably haven't heard of them. But what makes this band, Heavy Metal Army, special enough to have a whole big long episode about them? Like, what sets them apart from every other piece of vinyl that's hanging up on Neil Tanaka's wall? Well, to start off with, you might not have heard of these guys because they're not from like Nagoya or Tokyo or Osaka. They're from way down at the bottom of the Japan right there. They're from Okinawa. So part of their relative obscurity in recent years might just be due to geography. A similar case could be made for the excellent band Saber Tiger, who are way up at the opposite end of Japan in the north. So they're sort of outside of the regular Japanese heavy metal scene, although they do have some connections, given that Kyoji Yamamoto from Bow Wow actually played some guest guitar on their first and only album. But the real reason you might not have heard of these guys is they're weird even for a Japanese metal band. Like I said, they only put out this one album way back in 1981, and it's a doozy, mostly because of Yuki Nakajima's keyboards, as you're hearing now. There was sort of a little bit of an established tradition of very keyboard heavy metal / hard rock already going on in Okinawa with the band Murasaki, but those guys were way more deep purple-ish. Heavy Metal Army is pretty unique sounding. Their keyboards are much more intentionally synthetic and sci-fi sounding. Hiroto Arasaki's vocals are also worthy of note. They tend to vacillate between this sort of like narration style with little injections of melody during the verses, and then it builds up into the big choruses. They get super melodic with him layering his own vocals over Yuki Nakajima's backing vocals. Just like that. But obviously the really weird sounding outer space keyboards are the highlight of this album for me, and probably for most people that enjoy it. There's a whole lot of cool back and forth between some very Tony Iommi sounding lead guitar and those like weird spooky keyboards. I almost feel like you could describe this album as what Children of Bodom might have sounded like if they had formed in the 70s. And it is very 70s sounding, even though it came out in 1981. There's a lot of interesting like heavier moments where it goes into this new wave of British heavy metal sounding, almost sort of proto-thrash riffing. It's very budgy sounding at times, and that's never a bad thing. Just ask our boys in Metallica. But those weird sci-fi keyboards really stick out and are sort of like this band's calling card, and they enable them to push this into like progressive metal territory. There's some really strange turnarounds. Because right here, this is a pretty normal verse, but then watch what happens. The keyboards provide this extra melodic voice for the band to do a lot of weird counterpoint stuff like this in it. And it's also very effective for linking together the different sections of riffs with these little classical ostinatos. There's a lot of cool parts like this where the very hard-edged rhythm guitar kind of bounces off of the keyboard melodic lines in an interesting way. I mean, maybe this stuff was a little bit too weird for like 1980s metal, but it sure helps them stand out. So I would definitely recommend the heavier songs of this album in particular, like this one entitled Yes or No, the title track of the album, or the third to last song, Street Cellar. But it's not just all these like pounding anthems. These guys are very prog rock, particularly in their slower moments. The final song on the album, Bird of Destiny, starts out sounding almost like a Vangelis song or something. These like very brash but also rather atmospheric keyboards leading into some very 70s style like album oriented rock, maybe a little bit of jazz fusion with the very soft piano there in the background and the technically adept bass playing. A lot of the sticking point for people with Japanese metal comes down to the vocals and the lyrics, specifically a lot of wacky accents and not the best English, but that's not a factor in this band. This guy's pronunciation is perfect and he's very soulful. Get your lighters out for this part, man. That is classic 70s rock. Very well done and an excellent way to cap off the album. So if you manage to secure a copy of this, you'll notice that it doesn't just say Heavy Metal Army on the album cover. It says Heavy Metal Army and then there's a little number 1. So technically, the title of this album is Heavy Metal Army 1 because it was supposed to be the first in a series of albums, but that didn't end up happening, which is a damn shame because Heavy Metal Army is a great heavy metal album.
Pretty fucking cool. It's pretty fucking amazing. So
Heavy Metal Army breaks up when the guitarist and the bassist leave, but you still got a drummer, a keyboardist, and a vocalist. So Heavy Metal Army, pretty obscure band, but a decent amount of old school heavy metal maniacs still worship that album. I have not heard anybody mention the band members' post Heavy Metal Army project entitled Eastern Orbit like at all. And it's a damn shame because honestly, I might even enjoy this more than Heavy Metal Army. I mean, you might as well think of this as the second Heavy Metal Army album. It definitely picks up where that band left off and pushes even further into like the weird progressive direction they were hinting at. The sole Eastern Orbit album, entitled Future Force, honestly, at least in my ears, has a much heavier guitar sound, and they've really amped up a lot of like the progressive rock and classical music influences that were pretty latent within Heavy Metal Army's original sound. But to that equation, they have added a whole lot of like early 80s Hawkwind style space rock. The lyrics have changed too. There's not as many love songs on this one. Most of it is like weird science fiction short stories.
In the year 1999, from the far cosmos, otherwise known as the Third World, an unknown terror reaches out. Nobody knows what it is nor its powers.
See, they even do like the wacky Hawkwind style narration on some songs in this album. It's not really like a full-on concept album. Instead, it's just like a whole bunch of short stories set to music. And as always, the keyboards are amazing. So I would highly recommend at least keeping an eye or an ear out for that Eastern Orbit album, particularly if you enjoyed Heavy Metal Army. I feel like this is a really cool follow-up to it. It's not all just that very like pompous prog rock type stuff though. There's plenty of like aggressive heavy metal on it. Particular standout being the blistering Madam X, which has a whole lot of great new wave of British heavy metal style harmonies to it, as well as a whole lot of that nasty, dark proto-thrash that was on the first album. And Hiroto Arasaki's vocals are great as always, doing that same sort of thing where it's like starting out as narration and then has like little commentary bits that then resolve into melodies. Almost reminds me of a much more power metal oriented like Scott Weinrich from St. Vitus in that respect. This keyboard part coming up right here is fucking badass. Check this shit out, dude. Okay, that's like super weird, but I love it. I love this whole album. Heavy Metal Army and Eastern Orbit. Get each of their albums. They're great if you like old school heavy metal with weird fucking keyboards in it. But how influential were they on the metal scene at large? Well, I really had to do some digging, but I think I've found at least a couple bands that show off a little bit of that old Heavy Metal Army influence. The first one is this really odd sort of like heavy metal / kind of pop idol project from the 80s. They're sort of like the Japanese answer to that old British band Girls' School, and that it's all girls in the band. But their songwriting style and oddly dark atmosphere at times, I don't know, it kind of smells like Heavy Metal Army to me. Albeit a much more mid-80s version of Heavy Metal Army with a whole lot of like power metal and thrash going on. The name of this band is Shoya, and now they're gonna show ya what they do. You get it? Like Shoya.
I made it joke.
Ow.
아니 원스 여러분들이
Anyways, what made this band stick out to me, apart from the fact they were all girls and they look pretty gosh darn adorable on the album cover, is the near omnipresent weird keyboards. Even in the more vocal-led parts like this, Miki Nakamura is still like cranking out the organs and weird sci-fi bleepy bloopy noises, which is good because this is a decidedly more pop-oriented album, even if it has a lot of like thrashy power metal riffs in it. The keyboards add a little bit of extra thickness to the sound, which is appreciated because for whatever reason they mix the guitars a lot lower than I would have liked. This vocal line right here has a whole lot of Visual K vibes for me at least. Also a little bit of like an 80s anime soundtrack thing going on, with those excellent soulful layered vocals. Hey, there's the guitar riffs. I knew they were around there somewhere. And much like Heavy Metal Army, they have a lot of cool trade-off solo battles going on between the keyboards and the guitars. I also like how the keyboards kind of have this like odd sort of grinding undertone to them. It gives everything this like really cool atmosphere. There's the guitar solo. I feel bad they mixed Miki Igarashi's guitar so low to make it more of like a pop album because she's a damn good guitarist. Again, very like proto-Visual K sounding. Those very strong melodies reminding me a bit of X-Japan. And if that doesn't sound like something you'd hear on a Dio-era Rainbow album, I don't know what does. Overall, really cool album, this one. It's called Queendom, and it sort of exists in this weird space between like pop music and kind of a dark 80s power metal thing. Came out in 1986, but they've got 15 other albums that I've yet to hear yet, so that's definitely worth checking out. But speaking of Visual K, how about a Visual K band that, at least for me, sounds a lot like they were listening to a whole bunch of Heavy Metal Army when they were kids. So here's a really, really obscure band. Probably the most obscure one on here. And I kind of am kicking myself that I hadn't mentioned them earlier because the vocalist for this band, After Image, his name is Seiji, and he's actually the current vocalist for Moi Dis Moi, but I did not know that when I was doing research for my Moi Dis Moi episode. I just happened to see that, you know, he's gone by Seth in Moi Dis Moi for years now, and he's like super mysterious, but most people are pretty sure that he's actually this dude named Seiji, who used to be in a whole bunch of different Visual K bands. But in this case, I think this is his first band, After Image, man. This stuff really fucking slaps, and I wish I'd known about it earlier. You can tell this is an early band for this guy, and for probably everybody involved in it, because there's some songs where they clearly wrote it after jamming on another band's song for a while. For instance, okay, like Loudness, everybody knows Loudness. They got a song goes like Hell on their 1985 album, Thunder in the East. Features an interesting transition from a very braggadocious Akira Takasaki riff into some dank thrash metal.
I own my trolls. You'll never be as awesome as me.
In 1994, After Image put out the song called Setsuna that features a very similar intro riff with a very similar transition into some more thrashy shit. However, once that thrashy shit starts, that's when you start hearing a whole lot of what I believe to be Heavy Metal Army influence, with those super heavy, like, layered keyboards that are very, very prominent in the mix. I mean, I'm glad Seiji is doing work with Moi Dis Moi now because he's got a great voice, but honestly, I wish there was more After Image material that really only had just like this one EP from back in the 90s, and it sounds damn good. It has this weird sort of like thrashy but also very gothic kind of power metal psychedelic thing going on. Very unique even for Visual K, which is full of bands that all have like very unique and strange sounds, or at least it did in the 90s. So you gotta wonder, how did this guy from this like heavily melodic sort of speed metal band end up getting in contact with Mana for his weird sort of like gothic black death power, whatever the hell metal? Well, I'm pretty sure homeboy Mana, he of the wacky YouTube cooking shows, probably heard the After Image song entitled After Image, and let me tell you, that shit goes gothic as fuck, my dude. But, and I might just be hearing things, I feel like this has a major Heavy Metal Army feel to it, with how all of like the song's main melodies are bounced between the guitars and the keyboards. They sort of fill in the blanks of each other's melodies in a very aesthetically pleasing manner. Although obviously this is quite a bit darker than Heavy Metal Army and has nowhere near as much like weird sci-fi shit going on, I feel like they still were probably an influence on this. And of course there are very strong Visual K, X-Japan style catchy lead guitar lines. Very melodious solos. And lots of cool little guitar effects like this, him just picking out those individual notes and letting them ring into the piano bits there. That's pretty cool stuff, but it's also very gothic! Okay, here we go. I think this is why Mana was like, I need to get that dude to be in my band. Because this sounds like something, I don't know, fucking speed metal version of Malice Miser. These crazy, like, organ and string arrangements. That's pretty darn interesting stuff. The whole EP is very interesting. And it probably costs like $1 bajillion to buy it nowadays, so just listen to that shit on YouTube, dude. But yeah, that's how you get... you start out heavy metal army, it then sort of transitions into this wacky like girl pop stuff after all the prog rock, and then eventually ends up in like super gothic visual K. I believe there is a fairly clear line of progression. Even if you disagree with me on that, I feel like all the bands I talked about today were pretty darn good. So thanks for listening to me yammer on about them, and I'll see you next time.
You'll actually, you should kill yourself.